podcast where we explore big issues and our guests' ideas about them. I'm your host, Zack Hassan, a junior doctor from Scotland. If you're interested in thinking critically about the world around us, then this is the podcast for you. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Billy Palmer. Billy has previously worked at the National Audit Office and now works for the Nuffield Trust, a health policy think tank. He holds a PhD in health service research from Imperial College London, where he currently also holds an honorary research fellowship. He's completed 2 master's degrees, one in mathematics from Cambridge University and one in global politics from Southampton. In this episode, we delve into all of the issues around the NHS workforce plan. We get into the history of NHS staffing decisions, recruitment and retention and how this compares to other countries, the problem of transition costs with the NHS model, how to tackle spiralling agency costs, and we also ask what pragmatic options a new government could take. If you stay tuned until the very end, there's a bonus section where Billy shares his top policy recommendations for an incoming government. So that's if Wes Streeting happens to be listening, if you believe the polls. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Billy.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this topic.
Well, in terms of workforce, or in terms of health policy in general, almost by mistake. So I definitely wanted to work in public sector research, and then at one point in my career, turned up, and I think the HR department wasn't expecting me, and so took me to a door with health on the front, where I was intended to go to education. And that was, I guess, one fork in the road, and then subsequent to that ended up specialized, so that took me towards health service research, and at that point I started doing a PhD, which sort of cemented my knowledge and, I guess, a sort of career in that area. And then workforce, just, I guess, a good 10 years ago or so, I led a piece of work looking at the supply of clinical staff to the NHS. And it was at the cusp of when, like, it's difficult to remember that far back, when genuinely it was a bit of a Cinderella subject, the workforce, and people were still at the stage of, oh, we need to think about the workforce. And that seems like a distant memory, because I think people at least are now conscious that the workforce is the most important resource and foundation of health services. So yeah, I did that, and then moved across to uh, the Nuffield Trust think tank on the basis of, it's an area that I had worked on, felt passionate about, so it'd be interesting to lead a sort of a wider program of work around
And
those issues.
most people will know the Nuffield Trust because they go to a gym that says Nuffield on it, and
Yeah,
they're familiar with like the spa facilities.
yeah.
But might not quite know that they also do a lot of health policy research. So, what kind of things are they interested in, and do they come at it from a particular point of view?
Yeah, so just by way of clarification, there's quite a few different Nuffields around. There's a Nuffield Foundation, which is a separate, essentially, sort of think tank that looks actually primarily not at health, sort of at other issues. There's ourselves, the Nuffield Trust, who just an independent charity, and then there's Nuffield Hospitals, and there's Nuffield Gyms, uh, and there's Nuffield College in Oxford. Most of them all stem from the same person, and who gave pots of money, but we're all independent of each other. So sadly, I do not have like discount gym membership as part of my terms and conditions, regrettably.
That's one policy that you clearly still need to work on.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about well-being policy. I've pushed the evidence to them, but we've not got there yet. So yeah, so we're sort of independent of that aspect, and we're, a set up as a small charity, politically independent, and our role is to try to inform health policy debate. And sometimes that is about defining what the issue is and
Mhm.
highlighting it. Sometimes it's about getting an understanding of why that might be happening, and then sometimes it's about suggesting policies to improve it.
And I think that what you said, that the workforce issue has really come into the public consciousness. I've definitely noticed that in the last 5 years, whereas before it was only people who were really into health policy that were saying, "Hey, there's a problem here." But now I think it's got to the point that people are struggling to get a GP. We know that there's long waiting lists. I think people really sense that something needs to change, but they don't know exactly how we got here. I wonder, because you've done quite a lot of work in this, what
Yeah.
are the different jigsaw pieces in how we've got into such a bad place with the workforce?
Yeah, it's an important question to look back at history, because you can learn quite a lot from that. And actually, the history of the NHS, almost from day one, is littered with some terrible policy decision making around the workforce. Um, as early as the 1950s, various commissions and high-profile journals were saying, "Oh, I think we've got too many staff." And to put that in perspective, we now have 12 times more doctors than we did at that period. We now have 6 times more nurses. It was a heroically bad assumption to think we had enough. So that was, that's 70 years ago. And then, even looking back at the sort of 2010s, you had this decision making where people were trying to retrofit staffing to um, some fairly ambitious or overly ambitious efficiency targets. So year after year, there was assumption that, okay, we probably need more nurses next year, but then thereafter, in the medium term, we can probably cut down and become more efficient. And they kept on it year after year, even though they saw the trend always bucked that. They'd always wanted more the next year, but we kept on doing it. And so at least, from that history of undersupply and then trying to make do and fill gaps, we've finally got to a position where people are taking the numbers game a bit more seriously and a bit more ambitious in terms of making sure that we don't err on the side of undersupply of staff.
And
But
were those decisions that we needed to make, was it the right thing to do at the time? Or, have, for example, other countries been making different decisions that mean they're in a better place? Like, I noticed that our staffing ratios, like, we've only got 8 nurses per 1,000 people,
yeah,
whereas Norway's got 18.
yeah,
Now, is that right? Should we be being more like Norway? Or, what are your impressions of
yeah,
where the UK and England, especially, stand compared to other countries?
yeah. We're pretty middling when it comes to most markers. Um, and actually, the international comparisons, it's pretty eye-watering, the differences of some of them. If you go to some of the highest and the lowest, you get sort of tenfold differences in clinicians per head of population. Albeit, I don't think we're suggesting we should go towards the lowest, like the Mexicos, the Costa Ricas that have very low levels of clinicians. But as you say, Norway is vastly higher. Sweden, Denmark, likewise. Those Scandinavian countries typically have high. Netherlands as well, are slightly closer to home. But on most measures of the workforce, we're fairly similar to countries like France.
Mhm.
So we're pretty middling. I think one of the fairly unique characteristics of the NHS is the fact that it is a national system, and therefore there's more of a precedent for, well, more of a need for national decision making about training numbers, workforce planning. That's why we've had these various points in time where they've tried to do some workforce planning but just got it wrong, because they've not put sufficient priority on making sure there is at least enough staff. I mean, that should be very high up on your list.
Mhm.
Don't put yourself on it. That should be one of your highest red ratings of risk, is don't get yourself in a position where you're understaffing.
I mean, it really relates to my experience because, being a hospital doctor on the ward, I feel like, if I want to do something, maybe I need, something needs to happen for my patient. So I need to tell a nurse, it takes me 10 minutes to find the nurse because there are just not enough nurses. That's not just impacting on
Yeah.
the amount of work, it's making my work slower as well. I can do less because of the supply issues. Is when you're looking at the numbers, because I get the sense that you can actually see the numbers on this. You're the data guy as well as the big thinking guy. How what numbers are needed to correct this undersupply?
Well, I mean, if we just go for the immediate history and just focusing on the English example, they have managed to get 50,000 more nurses in the last 4 years or so. They've actually, in terms of numbers in the last few years, there's been fairly sort of impressive increases. But that's not to say that there aren't incredible challenges, right? It's quite
Mhm.
odd to look at that underlying headcount and try to square it off with the experiences that staff are feeling. And I think there's essentially an issue of growing pains in
Mhm.
this because there's been a substantial increase, and it's been an increase since 1949. But I think in particular, in the even if you track the last 4 years and the last 20 years or so, it's substantial. And the thing is that you need to grow your workforce with the other supporting resources around it. That might be about getting the skill mix right. The
Mhm.
example you just gave about, can you find other, clinicians on your team able to help you? Is there the nurse available there to, make your job more efficient?
Mhm.
Well, have we always done that well? And I think that's the piece around making sure that we grow
Mhm.
all the resources in the right levels, in the right balance. I think that's something that's inherently quite difficult to do because I think
Mhm.
that's where the intersect of political decisions and the shininess of, a national target of ex nurses or ex GPs. Often within that, we start to lose the really important nuance of,
Mhm.
you know, do we
So
have the
I'm getting the sense that you're saying this isn't really about just headline
yeah
numbers, which have actually been going up. This is about how we balance the actual skills of the workforce to the demand that is being created, demand that is
yeah
increasing. And, does that include thinking a little bit more about how we're doing work and trying to make smarter decisions that maybe politicians don't have time to make?
So it's exactly that. And don't get me wrong, there are some that today there will be probably 17,000 plus or minus 50% nurse posts not being filled, um, even with temporary staff. I think some of the numbers that you use for vacancies slightly over egg it because you do have quite a lot of temporary staffing. Sometimes that's good
Mhm.
for the employer and the employee, but there are vacancies. Okay, so we do need more, but to the point of getting the balance right, you've got some really tricky decisions about how do you appropriately balance, time to educate, support, supervise others within the team versus the provision of direct clinical care, to demarcate time for organizational development,
Mhm.
because for most of these clinicians, they will have some role in terms of leadership, direction of the team. Do they have the time to do that well at the moment? Because if they don't, you, you're pretty doomed in terms of making sure you've got an efficient, productive team.
Yeah. And in terms of that efficient team, one thing that I've noticed as well is about filling those gaps is that we pay a lot more for agency staff than we do to actually keep nurses, doctors retained in a sort of in a way that would give the patient continuity of care. Is that something that, is coming up? Because it's definitely something that the opposition can use as a headline figure. We're spending X amount on agency nurses. How terrible is that?
Yeah.
What's the probably more complicated story behind that?
Yeah, and it is complicated, and it's one where I'm sort of contractually obliged as from a research background to say, oh, I wish we had a bit more data on this, because it's very difficult to unpick the spend figures of to what extent is that increased volume, they're just filling more posts, and to what extent is it higher actual unit costs, which might be considered to be, poor value for money for the taxpayer, the
Mhm.
patient, as it were. Um, but it does highlight an issue in terms of retention, and I think as the NHS, they've been playing catch up to a degree in terms of the changing behaviors, motivations, pressures, really understanding,
Mhm.
what's going on in the service. And we've seen, just dramatic changes in terms of, I think it's something like fourfold increase in people citing health as a reason for leaving their role. Similarly, it's a fourfold increase over the course of something like a decade for people citing work-life balance as a reason for leaving their role.
Mhm.
And I think the NHS has been fairly slow to catch up, but there's actually some silver linings here. There was a very
Yeah.
nifty a study done on some retention programs from about, well, just sort of pre-pandemic, effectively. And they did show that a national program that had no national target attached to it, they didn't set any local targets. Effectively, they just gave, here's some data for you to understand who's leaving. Here's a bit of central capacity if you need help developing and delivering your strategy. But then go ahead and go and do it in your local area. And it seemed to reduce nurse retention, and that seemed to be associated with lives saved as well. So it's pretty positive
So
all around, really.
perhaps there's the beginning of a solution in there because you've said, you know, showing NHS trusts the data actually helps them solve the problem, and that you're having problems getting the data on some of the aspects of the problem. If you're having problems as a researcher, I imagine the NHS trusts themselves are having problems too. Is this just a symptom of that? Although it's a national health service supposed to be, is it becoming fragmented in the sense that, there's so many CCGs, so many acronyms, so many different players that is really hard to know what is going on out there.
Yeah. And I mean, there's two ways of knowing what's going on out there. Either you do it from that top level and have really sort of detailed data and try to unpick it, which is like fiendishly difficult, because once you start to disaggregate by staffing group and then the different characteristics within that, you can assume there'll be some differences by age, gender, ethnicity, whether someone qualified from overseas or not, where they are on pay scales, etc. So that's a difficult one, but more could be done on that
Mhm,
front, and it's probably something where you can pool that effort and then pass the insights down for the actual individual employers to learn from that. But then the other way to do it is from a bottom up approach, right? Because everyone's got a line manager,
mhm,
and it's about ensuring, and they could have a good understanding of what's going on with the people they're managing, but do they have the time and space to be compassionate managers and to be able to feed their insights back up the chain? So I think we struggle both on that top down and bottom up approach
mhm,
at the
mhm.
moment. But as I say, there's there are some programs of work that seem to be having some positive effect on that front.
So how do you get around that then in your job? Because you've published some great work on what you think where the workforce should be going. Um, you know, how have you approached it, and what have you come up with? What are the numbers showing?
In terms of levers, or
Yes.
yeah, um, yeah. So particularly in terms of when we looked at retention and even things like sickness absence, we were able to spot some fairly worrying trends a few years ago, and we tracked them. And part of our role on that front was really just to highlight that this is a real problem that we need to take very seriously.
Mhm,
And so, part of that role is just, a monitoring role, shining a light on where we think there are some big problems, making sure that, people are aware of that. And then, the next question is understanding why it's happening and what the solutions are. That is more challenging for us as a organization. We're sort of fairly reliant on, what evaluations are ongoing, what things that aren't currently evaluated could be.
mhm,
Um, and that then becomes a bit tricky, because there are a lot of potential natural experiments going on,
mhm,
not least between the four UK nations. There's quite distinct differences in the terms and conditions, the
mhm,
different programs that have been implemented for around recruitment and retention that we could and should be learning from. And then even within the English system, there's 200 odd providers, and within that, lots of different teams doing slightly different things. But to really understand them requires some effort. And again, it just comes down to the issue of, are we sure that that as a system we are demarcating enough time for that sort of thing,
mhm.
to really learn the lessons, to really explore it. It's not easy to know if
No.
initiatives have
And
worked.
and it is true that as, the four nations have become devolved, like they have gone in slightly different directions about how they've structured the health service. And perhaps the most recent development in that is Rishi Sunak's NHS workforce plan. I say it's Rishi Sunak's, but it's really the Department of Health, isn't it? Um, but this is being touted as like the big solution to this problem. Whereas I've seen other people describing this as like this is like trying to fix a leaky bath by turning the taps on full. What's your impression as someone who's a bit closer to the real picture on this?
Mm. So I think we probably we similarly have used metaphors around leaky baths as well. So we've probably side on that is in terms of a real risk to this, because it does have very bold ambitions, and I mean they really are bold. If actually the staffing numbers were to be realised from the long-term workforce plan, it's it would require almost half of public sector workers to be in the NHS by 2036, 37. and it would require something, the equivalent to 6% on income tax to actually fund it. So these are really bold ambitions in terms of an increased amount of workforce capacity within
Mhm.
the NHS. To get there, they've hedged a lot on just training more, but we've been trying to highlight it's not just about increasing your training places. You need to be getting people through training and into the NHS and then keep them there for the first few years.
Mhm.
And that's become, particularly in some professions, like very leaky.
Yeah.
And that's bad for everyone because no one sets out on that clinical course, potentially loading themselves with student debt, depending on where in the UK they're training in particular, and not completing. Of course, some people won't complete the course, and it might be the best thing for them. And of course, some people might choose
Mhm.
not to work in the NHS, and
Mhm.
that might be fine. But certainly, the numbers that we're losing on that front is worrying. So, just by increasing training places by somewhere between sort of 2/3 and for medics doubling the places, that's
Mhm.
putting a big risk unless you're fixing that pipeline.
Yeah, because my concern is that they're all of those new junior doctors are going to get to their FY2, think, oh wow, this is really tough work, like not coping with this at all. Oh, I can get paid, quite a bit more for being a locum,
Yeah.
um, or I can get paid quite a bit more by being in Australia for a few years, although the government's starting to clamp down on that. Um, you know, What's the solution to the retention problem, do you think?
Well, we need to understand motivations better,
Mhm,
um, and it feels fairly incredible given the tens of billions that are spent in this area and the significance of some of the decisions around, the pay review bodies, for example, that we don't really have that good a data on why people are leaving, where they're leaving to, what those other options are, what they're, how they're making those decisions. These are things that you could fairly easily test. Um, but you can read the 300 pages of the pay review body evidence and reports and be none the wiser about what they're going to be recommending at the end of it.
mhm,
And of course, pay's not everything, but it's just indicative of
yeah,
the lack of evidence we have here. And just one thing on this, on the retention side, is that we know, for example, like education experience, that educational experience is important. How they are in their placements and during and at university. Just increasing the numbers won't make that easier. It probably makes
yeah.
things harder because you need to have high quality supervision,
And
educational
there's more to
facilitators, etc.
coordinate. So
Yeah,
yeah, so this is not just a simple like,
no,
oh, we need more numbers. And the other thing that people will be thinking listening to this is okay, it's all very well. Okay, we might need more people in the NHS. We might need to change how we're doing things there, but there's increased demand. This is all going to cost more money. And is that worth it? A lot of people are, rightly, I think, suspicious about paying an ever greater check from taxpayers' money into the health service, especially if they are not convinced that they're going to get benefits from that. So I suppose the first question, and this comes back to what Keir Starmer is saying ahead of the general election, is it true that we've got to fix the economy first before just being able to pile a lot of money into the health service? Is that the way that you would frame it? Or, what advice can you give the general public on how to see this a bit more intelligently?
yeah. Um, well, it's a tricky one, and in some respects, there's a political decision underneath it. Um, and of course, for people approaching an election, they're having to make, balancing a political equation on it. But in terms of where we stand spending, we're fairly middling compared to comparative countries. There's some that spend a lot more on healthcare, some less. So although we have spent more, and people look at what is a very large number in terms of the NHS budget, we're not. It's not like we've got to the top of the pile in terms of how much we spend.
Mhm,
But there's a case of what's the overall spend, and then also do we allocate it in the right areas? And I think we've not been very good at making sure. And it comes down to a similar argument to have we got the skill mix right and have we grown all the resources up correctly? The allocation of funding between primary care, secondary care, and public health is very important. And I don't
mhm,
think we've got that right. And that does have implications in terms of sustainability because everyone talks a good game in terms of prevention, whether that's sort of primary or secondary. prevention, but
Mhm.
actually they very rarely sort of back that up with the funding and the allocation. So I think that there certainly needs to be some scrutiny, not only over that headline number, and that is, as I say, that to some degree that's sort of the political decision and a question
Mhm.
for the country about what sort of health service do we want, what level of provision do we want to have available, but also are we getting the most out of it? And I think in the past, all the discussion about getting more is the sort of technical efficiency, like squeezing the sponge harder, and
Mhm.
you look at the all the feedback from NHS staff at the moment. Now's not the time to be trying to get these sort of technical efficiencies out. You need to be thinking smart about where do you allocate your resources to get your best bang for
Yeah,
buck.
I've heard it said on the board that yeah, one way to really make the costs look good is just to close the hospitals because then you wouldn't be spending any money. But that kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But you seem to be saying this isn't really a binary choice between paying more money or accepting the status quo. You seem to be saying there's a third option. We could change the way we're doing work. We can change the balance of payments between different parts of the health sector. And I think there's agreement that we need to be spending more money on GPs and primary care, on preventative medicine. Do you see any easy wins in terms of how we get there?
Well, it's clearly not easy, and I mean, as with the history of the NHS and some fairly crass policy making on workforce numbers, there's
Mhm.
similarly been some fairly crass stuff on shifting care to different sectors. I think in sort of 2006 in the English NHS, they had this Our Health, Our Care, Our Say, which sort of trumpeted the idea of moving more care into the community. And if you look at like what then happened in terms of where they put their resources, they shoved a lot more doctors into hospitals and
Mhm.
not into the community. So we've made mistakes in the past there. I mean, it can happen, and most people are in agreement that there should be some sort of shift. So there is an opportunity. These services are run. It's about the question of can you rebalance it? It's very tricky to rebalance stuff when you're not growing.
Mhm.
So because then you potentially have to have losers, and that's very painful for services. It's very painful for commentators, those who are receiving those services. So whenever we've had like these positive shifts, it's typically been in a period of growth whereby effectively you can sustain the amount of funding you're having to your all the services, and those that you want to shift upwards, you then put all your additional money there. And they've done it when in terms of addressing geographical imbalances and in terms of this shift of money between services. So it's particularly tricky at the moment where there's not
Mhm.
there's not a lot of spare cash going around.
Yeah.
Quite the contrary. So that I think is the main challenge of how do you rebalance things when you're not putting more
And
significantly more money into the NHS.
and that seems to suggest to me, and I'm not saying that this is your opinion, but for me listening to that, it seems that maybe someone like Keir Starmer is on the right track, thinking that if we concentrate on getting more money into the economy, then we'll maybe find it a bit easier to make some of these decisions about what needs to happen with the health service because we can't afford to cut it any further. And and on that point, there's two options really. Like we either do something or we do nothing. And I wonder if we do nothing and the trends that you're identifying continue, how long can we sustain that before something, really goes wrong?
Yeah, I mean, we get into the world of speculation. Um,
I take it you don't like speculation at all.
oh no, I speculate the whole time, but just usually not that correctly. So I'm wondering, um, I think on the one, just going back on the point of funding first to buy myself some time. I think there's a political consensus behind broadly speaking, behind the ambitions of the long-term workforce plan. So to say that's England specific, but I don't think in any of the UK nations there's anything other than been articulation the
Mhm.
fact that you need more in total. I mean that comes at a cost. You can't do that for free. So there needs to be some additional money to meet that pledge. There's a question of how much, and if you don't do it, what will happen? And if you don't put enough staff in, then they squeeze on other things. If they continue to squeeze on capital budgets, we're going to become more inefficient. And it's sort of been quite interesting hearing the discourse, even in the last maybe 2 or so years, that people have turned their attention to sort of the productivity side of things. Um, and there's certainly been more focus on that. And I think with that, hopefully, comes an understanding of, yeah, you need to be investing in, an array of different, estates, scanners, the other capital expenditure that actually supports efficiency and supports, frankly, staff's well-being and ability
Mhm.
to do an efficient job. Because when it comes down to it, when you look at what affects retention, that's really high up on the list. People
Mhm.
want to do a good job, and when they
Yeah.
can't, they think about leaving. I say it's not the only reason, but it's a clear one that comes through for lots of different staff groups in lots of different sort of research areas. So it will, you know, if we
It's
carry
very
on this,
interesting that to me because it seems like so it's very clear to me the reasons why my colleagues say they're gonna leave or they want to quit their jobs is because they're so stressed out at work they feel like they can't do a good job and they see better lives on the horizon. But that's not coming through very clearly on the data. It sounds like, or maybe we've not concluded exactly what the reasons are.
yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that comes through in the research around it in terms of like the administrative data that is tracked day to day. It's just not really collected. I mean, there's information there. Was it because of incompatible relationship with your boss? That's one of the options they can tick
Mhm.
in the staff leaving data. But there's not collecting that sort of interesting information. But it no exists. It's well established. The question is that is there has it been a high enough priority to really address that?
Mhm.
And I think there is some movement there, but it seems that it's insufficient at the moment.
Yeah.
And some of the policy decisions moves across directorates. You would have a people team thinking about this, but actually, is that feeding up to those who are making the finance decisions about actually what do we need to put in place
Mhm.
to enable people to do a good job? So I think it's because it is a cross department, cross NHS issue, that's always where you have problems. We know
Mhm.
from the NHS, whenever you having to work across borders, whether it's between primary care, secondary care, between NHS and social care, that's always tricky when you've got,
Mhm.
you know, different budget holders, different responsibilities to actually make things happen.
Yeah.
But it has to happen eventually. And that, getting back to your initial question of how sustainable is it, they clearly need to get a grip on this.
Yeah. And it sounds like the consequences for not getting on top of it is reduced inefficiency.
Yeah. I mean, you
Yeah.
lose out all round. You do less. You have disgruntled staff who are then are more likely to leave, which then creates more pressure, and you get a fairly vicious cycle pretty
Mhm.
quickly. Again, one of the other reasons for leaving is about too much pressure. It's about workload. It's about not having the staffing around you. So there's definitely sort of a doom cycle unless you get on top of it. So
Mhm.
they've got this ambitions about numbers, but there's a lot of things they need to be doing around that to try to sort of change the dynamic at the moment.
Yeah. And let's think then about, post-election, new strategy, whoever wins. What should what should be the first few things that would make you jump for joy and think, oh, they're taking this problem seriously, they're starting to make decisions to move in the right direction? What does that look like? Is it about getting the right teams in place? Is it about thinking about maybe some ways that the NHS can actually make money? How do we get back to that part of the efficiency curve where we're operating at an optimal level?
Yeah. So I think I would try to press on the people to do the most boring things possible because actually they're probably the most important. Stay away from making bold claims on how many additional GPs you'll have in 5 years, and think about what are the governance arrangements and incentives about making sure there is good quality, sufficient capacity for education and training, so that we train the right number and we train them well, and
And
they
that they
then join the
stay.
NHS afterwards. And there's things that can be done with that. Everyone's over time, we and others have pointed towards the oddities of the education and training sort of tariffs and how this funding is made. But again, because it sort of sits slightly outside of most people's sort of core remits, it's sort of forgotten about, and it's deemed to be, a
Mhm.
fairly boring administrative task. But you know what? Those could be the ones with the biggest payoff. So I would
Mhm.
try to stick people away from any
And it
any
sounds like you're
eye-catching
you're
policies,
deeply suspicious of any sort of policy that is too headline grabbing or too seems
yeah.
like it's seeking attention.
Which is
And
exactly why I've not ended up as a politician.
yeah.
I'll be absolutely terrible at it for many
But
reasons.
maybe actually getting closer to the right answer to the question, what do we do? And one of the things that keeps coming up more recently that I've got especially worried about is people starting to say, well, maybe this is all evidence that the NHS model doesn't really work, and what we need to do is move to a much more European system of insurance or even American privatized system. And one of the reports from Scotland is that one of the ex chief executives of the NHS boards has kind of said something like that, basically saying we need to start thinking about using the private sector more because the current model is unsustainable. Are you just as suspicious of those kinds of sentiments, or do you think there's something in that too?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'm suspicious of is people underestimating any transition cost. And
Mm,
just going back to, the core workforce type issue, the one thing we've absolutely learned is every time you make a significant change to contracts, whether it was to clinical grading in the 1980s or the pay modernization of the early 2000s, it's ended up costing a lot more, and there's been various unintended consequences from doing it. And
mm,
I think that same principles you can expand to, systemic changes of the NHS. It's very easy to say, oh, if we just move to this, well, but that's not the system we have now. So
mm,
the steps to get there would be painful. So that's one point. The second point is, actually, if you look at the comparators of the UK's health services to other ones, so the Commonwealth Fund do some work on this. On most measures, we do okay. Overall, we sort of sit in the middle of the pack because we fall short on outcomes compared to
mhm,
many comparators. But in terms of efficiency, access, for example, we do well. And then so that's sort of a health service perspective. And then from the public perspective, actually, there's fairly good support for the actual fundamental model of the NHS.
yeah,
So I'm not convinced that there's a clear argument from it. We hear it every so often because it's sort of an easy thing to throw into the pan. But I think what's really important, and it's true of politics more generally, if people say something, oh, we should do something differently, what are the steps to get there? And
mhm,
really make them draw out what that counterfactual looks like. Because it's very easy to sort of promise quick wins. And we're not the only health service that is struggling at the moment. I've got a colleague of mine just looking at the industrial relations at the moment. Um, and you could probably you take headlines from different countries and play quite an interesting game of like match that to the country because it's very difficult to do.
yeah,
Um, we're not the only ones struggling. Of course, there's things we could learn, and of course, there's ways that you could improve how the NHS is functioning.
mhm.
It's I can't see anything compelling to say the fundamental thing we should do and the first thing we should do is some wholesale systemic change.
Yeah, so no top-down reorganizations. We need to get back to the kind of small, sensible, incremental changes
Yeah.
to help negotiate the problems.
Again, you've
Like that.
reiterated why I'd make for a terrible politician. Yeah.
No, but I think that that's probably what would actually appeal to most of the population. Like as you've said, like they don't really want to. There is widespread support for the NHS model. Something that I found that from the King's Fund was that people would actually want to pay slightly more in order to retain the NHS as it is, and probably the biggest thing that I worry about is losing that access because the NHS model is easy to forget is really based on free access, and if we move away from that, we're sacrificing the one thing we're
Yeah.
actually really good at compared to other countries.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, in terms of the structure of the NHS, is it even easy to do that kind of top scale reorganization anyway? With the structure that we've got of CCGs and lots of fragmented trusts, you know, is this really for politicians to be able to decide anymore?
I mean, it's technically speaking, it's within their gift to do some of this stuff. I think, yeah, I mean, so they could do. We look at there was fairly large change when the Lansley reforms came
Hmm.
um, in terms of how things were commissioned. I think that's nowhere near as big a change as what some people are suggesting. But even then, that was hugely expensive and had all sorts of unintended consequences. I think in terms of fundamentally, what there are some challenges in the current setup. The fragmentation of responsibilities between different settings and between different providers, social care to NHS, and then even within the sectors of the NHS, that does create problems. I think from my days at the National Audit Office, it was pretty easy to pre-populate one of the conclusions for every single piece of work we did that there's poor alignment of funding, accountability, and responsibilities, and we have that in the NHS. They do sometimes pull in other directions. There's ways potentially you can work around that, but fundamentally there are some problems. So you could see some changes in terms of responsibilities and what NHS trusts could do. It'd be interesting to see how, in the English system, how the integrated care systems do develop over time and who
Yeah.
really sort of takes responsibilities and to what extent do they start, treating their budgets in a more pooled way.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
that will be interesting to see. And that's, politicians could push in those directions and they
And
and
do
they
they
and they may
look
well
to
do.
places like the Nuffield Trust to help guide their policies? Do you see a real opportunity for you to, whereas a politician might, it might go on the pile of things to consider in the news cycle, actually if you're speaking directly to the integrated care systems themselves, this is this new sort of term for what the clinical commissioning groups are going to become. So they're going to actually make the choices about what money gets spent on. Will they be, is that an opportunity for you to help push things in a better direction using the data?
Yeah, using data and just being able to have those conversations in an independent way. Sometimes it's quite tricky with sort of the formal hierarchies that what gets reported up the line is typically what they assume that people want to hear up the line. Whereas if we can dive into certain levels, whether that's the commissioners of care or the providers or the actual employers themselves, take that understanding and then feed it back in an independent way. That's actually one of our sort of real sort of
Real
core
strengths.
advantages and
Yeah.
strengths, and that's what we can do, and that includes speaking to politicians and those in that and those in that sort of political sort of bubble and trying to sort of highlight
Mhm.
the realities of the challenge and the realities of the opportunities as well.
So if people want to get more involved in changing the care system and maybe they're a doctor or a nurse that feels like they can't make the changes that they want to in their normal job, could people make the jump to health policy? How would they get involved in the sort of work that you're doing if they wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, even as an organization ourselves, we employ a broad range of people. Some have clinical backgrounds, some, more quantitative, some qualitative, some with sort of service experience. Um, and other organizations are similar in terms of actual roles in it. I mean, there are various levels we can do it. The one thing I'd always plug is to when you speak to anyone, never sell the NHS short in terms of the career opportunities. There's some objective evidence that a clinical career can be very good in terms of the opportunities it allows. Actually, things like pay and security around it. That's not to undermine in any way the challenges that a lot of people are feeling working in the
Mhm.
NHS. But fundamentally, it can be a good career. And I do worry at the moment that the whole narrative is putting people off working in clinical careers at a time when we're desperately trying to recruit them. That seems a problem.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like third order in terms of like directly what people can do. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, the it's very important that policy and there's a whole ecosystem around it. We're a small think tank, and we've got counterparts at Health Foundation, King's Fund, but there's then you've got universities who are doing something similar, but again, sort of slightly different. And you've got sort of, as I say, this whole sort of ecosystem around health policy, and there's many opportunities for people to actually be part of that. Whether that's in a full-time basis or on a sort of part-time basis as well, sort of feeding in their insights and help. make a bit of change. Because I think I certainly get a sense that there's a search for slightly bolder policies at the moment. I think we've been through a period of a bit of policy orthodoxy, and it's ploughing on with a bit more of the same. But certainly some of the conversations I've had, people have been asking from some of the sort of national decision makers, asking for some ballpark and trying to understand, what are other countries doing? How could we adopt it here? And what can we learn?
I think
So
you might have coined a phrase there, policy orthodoxy. So you've made it to my last question, which is about what if people want to find out more about what we've been talking about, what could they go and read?
Well, I'll put a plug in for Nuffle Trust work. uh, all of our stuff is published online, and we have a set of pages particularly about workforce issues, but colleagues of mine who do a lot more on the sort of the broader perspectives about the NHS, even work and how that and the extent to which the NHS is or isn't being privatized, for example. That's all on our website. And from that, I think we try to be generous in terms of how we link to other people's work as well. So maybe that's a good starting point. But there's the other think tanks, some of the universities as well. So there's no end of places to learn a bit more about these issues. But of course, I mean, people feel free to contact me directly if they have any particular things they want to pick up on.
Well, that's very kind of you, Billy. And I'm sure not everyone will rush at once, or your inbox might get inundated. But you've been an absolutely fantastic podcast guest, so thanks for sparing the time to chat to us.
Thanks, Zach. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Was there anything that you wanted to say that we didn't get a chance to get into?
And maybe I characterized myself slightly wrong there. I think they really need to be bold, but they can be bold about some particular things. So we've been pushing very hard for them to do things like loans forgiveness schemes, which in some respects might sound bold, but it's a mile off top-down reorganization of the NHS. But it potentially could be something where you increase the numbers coming out of the staffing pipeline by 10%, 20%, 30%. Who knows? It's big amounts. The potential.
And that's what came out. It's not just about should you be bold or should you not. It's like, what are the right things to be bold about? You had a little bit more of a idea about than perhaps I did, and I think that was useful for the conversation.
Yeah. How's your clinical work going at the moment, though? Is it all right?
So I'm medical registrar in the Borders. It's now winter, so the geriatric ward is closed due to COVID.
Oh.
So it's I've had the most surreal experience in the last week of that there is no institutional memory of how things were happening on the ward during COVID. So everyone is asking questions about, what PPE are we supposed to wear, and trying to get things clarified with managers, and families just sort of barging in, not wanting to wear anything, seeing it all as a bit of an inconvenience. And and I'm just left with a surreal feeling of like, all of this has happened and we're no further. We haven't learned, the institutional memory has been forgotten. So, but I do enjoy my job. I think that what you say about being more positive about the NHS is really important, and it's something that I think the staff we're not doing it very well at the moment. I think that it's very rare that you would sit down with a colleague and you would talk about how much you're both enjoying your jobs.
Yeah, I know. Also, I don't want to gaslight people, right? Because they're the ones experiencing it. I can't be like, you know what? Actually, you've got your clinical qualification and permits you to do dot 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 dot, and afford you this, this, this. And I mean, that's not a great look. But and it's a question of how do you balance it. And I think there's lessons there for the professional associations as well. And I suspect to some degree they sort of regret quite how they've handled things.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm sure you've got a lot to get off to.
Yeah, I'll let you off as well.
If you like the podcast, the best way to support it at this stage is to tell your friends about it and share it on social media. You can use the hashtag Healthy Discussions or my Twitter handle @MontereyZack to tell me your thoughts about this episode. In the description, you'll find more about our guests' work and their book recommendations. Thanks to Health Education England North East, Health Education England South West, and Medics Academy for supporting this episode. All of us at the Healthcare Leadership Academy are grateful for their support.